Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Francesca Trinetti. I am a graduate of the Women's Spirituality Department here at CIIS. I am your moderator. I will remind everyone to please, I will remind everyone, please keep your microphones off. We're going to have questions at the end, so don't worry, we'll get to everyone, hopefully. Our first panelist is Elizabeth Ursak. She is adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She is the author of Women, Ritual, and Power, Placing Female Imagery of God in. I apologize, Skynet just activated, so I got pulled out. Elizabeth Ursak, her essay, Christian Feminist Theology and the Arts, appears in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Religion and Art, and her chapter on metaphor will be forthcoming in an Oxford Press book series on music and Christian theology. She holds a master's in divinity from the Yale Institute of Sacred Music and a PhD in religious studies from Arizona State University. She co-chairs the AAR SVL Women's Caucus and was the Women's Task Force Chair for the 2018 Parliament of World Religions. Her research interests include religion, imagination, the arts, and gender. Her music albums include Gratitude and Unspoken Touch.
Carol Christ has always been a trailblazer, and I now co-chair the Women's Caucus that she helped to co-found at the American Academy of Religion. On a personal level, Carol and I met during my PhD research, and our paths have crossed professionally many times. And our friendship deepened during the 5 hours of interviews I conducted with her about her life in a Across the Generation series in the Journal of Feminist Studies of Religion. I was going to go over Carol's early academic work, but I think much of this has already always been said. I do want to say that she made a point to say that she was raised in a lower end of the middle class with conservative parents. And even though she was valedictorian of her high school there in California, her parents expected her to teach at a high school until she got married. And it was really only mentors. And I'm saying this for all of you that are maybe in graduate work now, that it was a high school guidance counselor who got her to go to Stanford. And then it was an Old Testament professor and a humanities advisor that helped her get the scholarship that brought her to Yale. She also wanted me to know that while she was at Yale, and we heard Judith and Mara tell some wonderful events and accomplishments there, she also told me some funny stories and arresting stories. One is that she came from California as this tall blonde in miniskirts walking into a room with all these guys who would either smoke a pipe or a cigar based on what the professor was smoking that day. And that there were even like bets and talking of like, where is Carol going to sit? And I'm saying this because I'm sure Mara and Judith and Naomi, who was another contemporary of them, all experienced these kinds of effects. And you can see why they started to organize themselves about women. She did participate in the protests that led to the Title IX change at Yale, but there were smaller ones. And one that was endearing to me is that Yale Divinity School allowed women, and they were taking classes there, but they didn't change the bathrooms. And what that meant is that when women needed to use the restroom in New Haven, Connecticut, New England in the winter, it's pretty snowy, they actually had to leave the building to go somewhere else. And they asked for a change, and not much was happening, so they decided the best thing to do was to hold a sit-in in the male bathroom at Yale Divinity School. And this was done actually with much jocularity, and they put flowers in all the urinals, and they just sat there until the dean came down with the white flag and said, you know, you win, and they got their bathroom. I want to say this because I think there's so much seriousness and very, very serious issues that the women's movement really had to change. But I also want to point out that there was a lot of friendship and crossing over of male colleagues that were supporting the movement. So what I'd like to read is a letter that Carol wrote for the 40th anniversary of the Women's Caucus. This was in 2011. I was one of my first years attending the AAR, and when I heard Carol's letter, it's what made me really want to get involved with the Women's Caucus. I've been co-chair now for over 6 years, and we're now at our 50th anniversary, so it's very poignant. But I thought this was great for you to hear in her first person voice what was at stake to get women into the academy. This is from Carol. The receipt of an invitation for the 40th anniversary of the Women's Caucus takes me back to the summer of 1971. At the first meeting of women theologians at Alverno College, I proposed that we form a feminist caucus in the field of religion, as had already been done by feminists in several other fields. Since I was one of the few women at Alverno who had attended the annual meetings in the field of religion, I was delegated to call Harry Buck, then director of the AR, to ask for space in the program. Harry, who continued to support the work of women in the field through lecture series at Wilson College and through the magazine Anima, which he founded, offered not only space at the meetings, but a printout of the names and addresses of all the members of the AAR who were not obviously male. I invited all of them to come to a feminist meeting at the AAR in Atlanta. It's hard to imagine now, but before 1971, the women who attended the AAR in any given year could probably have been counted on one hand. I was a graduate student, but because the AAR was still a relatively small organization, I already knew many of the influential men in the field. When I arrived at the hotel, I was immediately waylaid by a senior colleague who told me he had been delegated to ask if our group planned to nominate a woman for the post of president of the AAR. If so, he wanted to know if we thought it would be gentlemanly or condescending for the man nominated by the committee to step aside. At that point, we had not even considered a move as bold as nominating a woman for president, but I did not tell him that. In those days, the president was elected by acclamation at an open meeting, which was generally poorly attended. Some 30 or 40 women attended our meetings in Atlanta, including Christine Downing, who became the nominee for president, Mary Daly, who became the first chair of the Women in Religion Working Group, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who along with me became the first co-chairs of the Women's Caucus, along with Sally McVeigh, the AAR and SBL. We chose Chris to run for president because she was the only woman among us who had presented a paper at the AAR. We came to the open meeting unannounced, nominated Downing for president, and with several men voting for her as well, managed to get her elected, much to everyone's surprise. The next year, the process of electing president was changed to a mail ballot, MAIL ballot. We also voted through the Women in Religion Working Group and Task Force in the AAR on the status of women in the profession. Due to the pressure from the task force, the AAR created a location for open posting of academic positions, which previously had been filled by the Old Boy Network. We believe we also compiled statistics on the small number of women in the academic appointments and in graduate school in the field. At the AR in those days, it was very much a gentleman's club with much pipe and cigar smoking, heavy drinking, and as we were to learn, though not through the official program, opportunities for scholars of religion to visit prostitutes. Truth is stranger than fiction. We learned of the last named activity when a friend of mine was asked by a male colleague if she thought it was now more appropriate for men in the field to sleep with women in the field rather than prostitutes at the AR. I'd also like to point out that that caucus group managed to stop having interviews done in hotel rooms, which is what had been done in the past. After 1971, it was never quite the same. At the 72 meetings in Los Angeles, Mary Daly presented After the Demise of God the Father, and Rosemary Radford Ruther discussed St. Augustine's Penis. Many of these groundbreaking presentations were collected in 3 volumes published by the AR and edited by Judith Plaskow and Joan Arnold Romero. In those heady days, we were not yet as diverse as we would later become, but we spoke to each other and made connections about the status of women in religion across time and space. Our excitement was palpable. It was not until some years later that women working in the field of religion began to separate themselves from each other along religious and disciplinary lines. That was a great disappointment to me and to many others. So Carol surprised many when she resigned a tenured full professorship in 1988 to move to Greece. And Mara in her talk went into that it was difficult for her once she embraced the goddess to achieve another tenured track post. She delivered her essay, Rethinking Theology and Nature, at Harvard Divinity School while she was a research associate in Women of Religion just before she made the decision to move to Greece. Royalties from her books and continuing invitations to lectures in the United States supported her new life, an indication of her continuing influence both within and beyond the walls of the Academy. We love you, Carol. We miss you, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Oh, yes. Kathleen is a sociologist of religion and gender in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Newcastle, Australia. Her areas of research are gender, feminism, and religion, and she employs feminist sociological frameworks to issues around women and religion, particularly around questions of the state and religious freedom, LGBTQI+, and gender-based violence in religious institutions. Kathy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I do have some PowerPoint slides that I might share in a minute, but I don't want to jinx it, so I might just start talking, I think. So my contribution today is called The Archbishop and the Feminist Theologian, Challenging Patriarchal Culture in Sydney, Australia, 2005. And I'm telling the story of when Carol came to visit Sydney and what unfolded during that time. So I'd like
Carol Rose, panel A.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Should I just continue? Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Awabakal people, on which I'm speaking to you today, situated on the mid-north coastal regions of Eastern Australia. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and especially acknowledge any Indigenous people present today. I thank the traditional owners for their generosity in sharing this beautiful country, and I recognise that this land has never been ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So moving on, in my undergraduate course called Gender, Religion and Power, I teach second-year students to look at ways to subvert and reposition dominant readings of religion as faith traditions based on male headship as a given. I introduce students to alternative accounts of reading religions, and one of these is Carol's work on patriarchy. As you probably know, in 2016, and Judith reminded us, she published an article in the British journal Feminist Theology titled A New Definition of Patriarchy, Control of Women's Sexuality, Private Property and War. And I set this as a text for the students to read. While they really enjoyed learning how to upend religion and patriarchy, the article also provides a way to understand the earlier event where Carol visited Sydney and a hullabaloo erupted. But first to the article. In this article, Carol outlined a more complex understanding of the concept of patriarchy that moves away from a generalised term that positions all women as continually oppressed everywhere. She focused on historicising the term and identifying the specificities and complexities of gendered forms of power in distinct historical periods. Different forms of patriarchy developed due to specific environmental, economic, and political circumstances. And in modernity, Carol defines patriarchy by the ways in which it links property ownership, war, and religion as central to the governance structures of patriarchal control. She promotes a theory of the social construction of power and patriarchy and argues that as much as these systems have been built, they can also be overturned as well. She critiques the essentialist account of patriarchy where women are passive and men are naturally aggressive. She states that the central link between historical and current forms of patriarchy is the reliance on gender-based forms of violence and the control of women's bodies and sexuality, as Judith was telling us earlier. Carol Carol says, patriarchy is an integral system created at the intersection of the control of women, private property, and war. Patriarchy is a system of domination enforced through violence and the threat of violence. It is a system developed and controlled by powerful men in which women, children, other men, and nature itself are dominated. To counter this, Carol identifies different kinds of societies, matrilineal societies, of which there are many current examples, including Australian Aboriginal kinship groups, where belonging and identity is gifted through the matrilineal clan structure. Carol herself focused on the Maozu people from southwestern China, a small population that have lived by matrilineal cultural ways for centuries. In this society, men are taught to be loving, generous, and caring. Women have control over sexuality, including childbirth, and biological fatherhood is not important. The nexus between private property, war, and religion is non-existent in this culture. My students watch the documentary film called The Women's Kingdom to engage with Maozu culture and hear people speak about their lives. Carol's point here is that there are historical and current alternatives to patriarchal systems that she herself lived in such a way in Greece. So this is my jumping off point to talk about Carol's visit to Sydney in March in 2005, in what turned out to be a very tough confrontation with the very elements that she identifies in her culture, in her article, as constituting patriarchy: the politics of private property, religion, and gendered violence. When Carol responded to an invitation to visit Australia, she had not long published her book, She Who Changes, Reimagining the Divine in the World. As you probably know, in this book, she sets out her claims based on process theology as inspired by Charles Hartshorne, whose philosophical work she greatly admired. Like Hartshorne, Carol was an avid bird watcher, as we were to discover when she arrived in Sydney. But before she even stepped foot in the country, her presence was clearly being seen as a threat to the dominant Catholic elite. A loose coalition of feminists, some in and around the edges of the Christian churches and others from goddess and pagan traditions, worked to organise Carol's visit. It began by asking the Dominican sisters to host a public talk at their large secondary Catholic girls' school, Santa Sabina, in Sydney. We had good connections with the nuns, and they had been generous to support public lectures by other well-known feminist theologians, including that of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza in 1995. These events were to sell out crowds for people hungry for theological insight and expansion, especially in the conservative climate of Sydney Catholic theology circles. The nuns readily agreed to Carol's lecture, and we began our promotion and ticket selling. However, a week out from the lecture, we received news from the nuns that the lecture could not take place at Santa Sabina. I personally was very upset. My mother had attended this well-known school, and my great aunt had been a nun and a music teacher there, and I had been there many times myself. So for me, the matrilineal line was personal, meaningful, and very strong. Getting to the reasons at first was difficult, but we learnt that the Catholic Cardinal of Sydney, the infamous George Pell, had ordered the Dominican sisters to cancel the lecture. They argued with him and stood their ground, but
Kathleen, you muted yourself.
unmuted. Where did I get to? Sorry.
You got to the infamous George Pell.
Great, thank you. So he ordered the Dominican sisters to cancel the lecture. They argued with him and stood their ground, but then they were told that if they went ahead with the lecture, he would cut off all funding to the school, which, as you can imagine, was a significant amount of money. He played the private property card and the threat of violence card, and they had no choice but to give in. We were fuming, but also sympathised with the nuns and put our heads together to find an alternative venue. Literally, across the street from the school was the Uniting Church, and they were happy to hold the lecture, and so it went ahead. Certainly the numbers were lower, but the event was wonderful, with Carol speaking together with a number of other theologians, including myself. I made a banner for the event with my kids, which read, "The feminine is divine and the divine is feminine." I'm just going to try and share my screen because I've got some images here. I hope you can see that. Can everybody see those images? I still have this banner that I made. There's Carol giving on the left in the Uniting Church, me on the right, and in the school, in the middle is the school, Santa Sabina. At the time, I penned an opinion piece for the main newspaper, the Sydney Morning Herald, which was published on the 11th of March after the lecture, to vent my frustration and annoyance what had happened, and to publicise the heavy hand of George Pell. In this piece, I asked why Carol's work had been considered such a threat. What was the actual danger her work presented to the Catholic hierarchy? Was it because she suggests that the image of God as exclusively male does not and cannot reflect women's experience of the divine? Was it because she knows that in many societies the divine has been represented by the feminine? Was it because she argues that the continuing abuse of women's bodies is related to an exclusive male pantheon? The dangerous ideas she was articulating are also a direct challenge to the main precepts of modern patriarchy that she sets out in her 2016 article, Private Property, Male Religious Power and Gendered Violence. You can see all of these in action in the way that the Cardinal usurped the public lecture and threatened the nuns and forced us out. But our responses were effective as well. We didn't bow over, we reorganised, we maintained our solidarity and friendship with the Dominican nuns, we published in the media and we got our message out there. We practiced matrilineality, at least symbolically and politically. The day after the public lecture, some of us took Carol to a well-known bird hide in Sydney, and we walked with her as she watched the bird life unfold before her, a perfect example of belief in practice via her understanding that creation is in a constant process of transformation, and a nod to Charles Hartshorne. If conceiving of God in a feminine form is a radical statement, then maybe that is an indicator of the kind of patriarchy we live in, because plenty of theologians have suggested this before. It can only be a dangerous statement to a patriarchal church. One final point, we loved having Carol in Sydney, and here are some of the images from the celebration dinner that we had after the talk. Plenty of people took notice, and there was a good... After my opinion piece was published, I got many emails from Catholics urging us to continue our work and saying how important it was. I was particularly upset by the number of Catholic women working in church organisations who feared speaking out because of losing their jobs, and I'm very sorry to say that the situation has not changed today. Cardinal George Pell is the third most powerful cleric in the Vatican, and despite being charged with child sexual abuse and going through 2 court cases, he has not resigned or been asked to. The current Archbishop of Sydney is just as conservative, and people employed in church organisations still feel threatened. But change is happening, as Carol reminds us. This is the fundamental principle of creation, and she showed us in word and life how powerful that can be. Thank you, Carol, for your wonderful contribution. You will be deeply missed.
Thank you, Kathleen. Our next speaker is Barbara Jean Davey. She is the author of Introduction to Pagan Studies and editor of the 3-volume collection, Paganism, Critical Concepts in Religion. She's earned doctorates in religion and environmental studies. She has taught courses in religion and ecology, sustainability thought, and big history at Concordia University, Carleton University, and the University of Waterloo. Barbara?
Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen.
We can see your screen.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to give a memorial toast in heathen tradition, and about what are the consequences of participating in this kind of ritual? So for those who don't know, heathenry is a form of contemporary paganism. Heathens revive pre-Christian traditions of Northern Europe. This includes Germanic, Norse, Baltic, Frankish, as well as early English traditions. Heathens are often quite distinct from feminist spirituality. Some heathens are notably racist, sexist, and homophobic, transphobic. Those sorts of people tend to attract a lot of attention, but most heathens are in fact quite a lot more politically progressive than most Americans and Canadians. And those more progressive people are the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to talk about inclusive heathens. These are the ones I'm most familiar with. I am myself an inclusive heathen. Inclusive heathens tend to be feminist, anti-racist, and espouse progressive politics. I just noticed that I am on the last slide of my presentation instead of the first slide for some reason. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning one. Sorry about that. So I have just recently finished a 2-year ethnographic study where I was doing participant observation research with heathens in Eastern Ontario as well as Southwestern Ontario. This included research with Vindisir Kindred in Southwestern Ontario. A kindred is kind of like a Wiccan coven, somewhat, not entirely. And I also was doing research at Ravens Knoll, which is a private campground in Eastern Ontario that hosts a lot of pagan festivals. It's a spiritual retreat center. And some of the people involved in Vindisir Kindred also help put on ritual events at Ravens Knoll. So there's a fair bit of overlap between these communities. So I'm going to be talking about mini. These are memorial toasts to ancestors in heathen tradition. This is a very common practice amongst contemporary heathens in North America as well as Europe. It's rooted in past tradition. We can see examples of this in things like the Old Norse text, Heimskringla, as well as the early English text, Beowulf, where people are making toasts as part of a ritual called sumbel. Sumbel is a ritual of sharing drinks and making toasts, sometimes giving gifts also. These practices that contemporary heathens engage in also evoke a longer period of tradition. As you can see in my slide design, I included this little image of a woman holding a horn. This is a picture of a Danish replica of a find from Birka, Sweden, of an Iron Age artifact from between 400 and 800 before the Common Era. So we have evidence that people have been engaging in this kind of a practice of using a shared vessel of drinking in a ritual context for a long time. In Canada, big heathen gatherings such as are held at Ravens Knoll, such as a Hail and Horn gathering, they use a very large horn, which you can see in the picture here. The woman who carries this horn has a weighty responsibility in more than one sense. This is a very big horn. It holds about 3 bottles of wine. So it's very heavy. But she also has a heavy responsibility because this woman, who's known as a biro in this tradition, sometimes in American practice, she might be referred to as a Valkyrie, but within Canadian tradition, she's referred to as the biro, which means horn bearer. So she's responsible for carrying the words that are spoken over the horn. This has a special significance in heathenry because words spoken over the horn are witnessed by the community in ritual. And this includes not just the human community, but also the deities, the dead, the ancestors, as well as the people who are assembled. These words are said to reverberate in the well of weird. And we can think of weird as somewhat like when Carol Chris talks about the ground of being, aspects of weird can be associated with that. But it also refers to the web of all our relations. So when people make a toast over the horn in a ritual context, this matters. It has a special significance because those words are shared and they are witnessed and they become part of the connections that hold us all together. People make toasts to the deities, but when they make it specifically to the ancestors, this is what we call mini. This happens in a variety of different contexts. One of them is an annual event conducted by Vindisir Kindred called Disablót. This is specifically an event which honors the female ancestors. It's held every January by the group. And it's specifically for making offerings and giving toasts to female ancestors, who in heathen tradition are referred to as Disir. This term Disir has a variable historical meaning. In North America, it tends to be equated with female ancestors, but it can also refer to other female personages of power, like Valkyries, like supernatural female guardians of different kinds, goddesses, but also female ancestors. So Vindisir Kindred, they make toasts to biological ancestors, or they can, but also to what we might call ancestors of affinity. This is a term I take from Daniel Foor, who wrote a book called Ancestral Medicine, where we have not just blood ancestors or biological ancestors, but also cultural ancestors, people we want to honor because of what they have contributed to our communities, that we want to celebrate, that we want to hold up as examples. So in Vindisir Kindred, for instance, people will talk about not just deceased female relatives that have passed on, but they'll also talk about women like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, people who were fundamentally important to the gay rights movement early on. Or in Vindisir Kindred, this is a kindred based in the Ottawa area. They have what they call a matron cult that honors a number of Canadian women who are important in feminist politics. They represent a number of firsts, like the first Aboriginal woman who was able to vote, first elected members of parliament, things like this, first members of the Senate. So what happens when these women are venerated as ancestors? I would suggest that making memorial toasts in this way, it passes on the values that come to mind when we make these toasts. The values that are brought to mind in rituals when we're giving offerings to the dead, when we're making toasts, they tend to be activated through this ritual practice. There's some evidence from this provided by an area of research called terror management theory. It's a portion of social psychology that has extensively investigated what happens when we are reminded of the fact that we're going to die. What empirical consequences are there? They've done hundreds of these studies now. Sometimes there are quite negative effects depending on what values are brought to mind, but if we make positive shared values come to mind in this context, those values tend to be expressed. Things like helpfulness, tolerance, inclusivity. I've seen these things happen in heathen ritual, in particular, when people express gratitude for their ancestors, what they have received from their ancestors, whether those are biological or ancestors of affinity, it inspires a desire to give in turn. So those values that are brought to mind in shared ritual, they tend to activate those shared values in community. This isn't an automatic thing. It doesn't always happen. There can be ritual failures, rituals that don't seem to work all that well, but I have seen it functioning well within contemporary heathen ritual. So when I raise a horn like this, and I say, "Hail to Carol Christ," and I recognize her as an icon of feminist spirituality, this helps bring the values that she taught in her work to new generations of people. It can inspire reverence for the goddess, respect for the earth as the ground of our being. It passes on the experiences that she shared when we retell what we have learned from her. For me, reading Rebirth of the Goddess was a formative experience as a graduate student. I was fortunate enough to be shared this work before it was published because Naomi Goldenberg was an advisor to me at the time and shared Carol's work with me. And it helped to give me a sense that doing ritual, participating in this kind of activity is both reasonable and meaningful. So I say thank you to Carol Christ for teaching us why women need the goddess. We also need you as our Vindisir, as a female ancestor. You can help pass on these values by telling Carol's story. May we become ancestors like her. Hail Carol.
Our next speaker is Purushomata Bilmoria. He works in Indian and cross-cultural philosophy, philosophy of religion and critical thinking. He's a lead scientist at the Purushomata Center for Study of Indian Philosophy and Culture at the People's Friendship University of Russia. He's also a principal fellow at the University of Melbourne, co-founder of Australianism Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. He serves as co-editor-in-chief of Sophia, International Journal of Philosophy and Traditions, and Journal of Dharma Studies. Recent publications include History of Indian Philosophy, Religion and Sustainability, Contemplative Studies in Hinduism, and Indian Ethics, Volume 2. Please welcome Dr. Bilmoria.
Thank you, Francisca. I hope I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are, sir.
Thank you very much. I pay my respects to the indigenous and previously enslaved people of this land and their ancestors. I come to this forum in remembrance of Carol P. Christ as a Hindu-Buddhist philo-theologian. I was in Australia in 2005 when Carol P. Christ had visited Sydney. I had not gone to Sydney. I was in Melbourne. I was working with fairly left Catholics like Max Charlesworth. So I came to hear about, well, we're going to carry an article or a report in Sophia, but somehow it didn't transpire. Anyway, so I thank Kathleen for reminding us of that very momentous moment. I begin with a Hindu invocation to Goddess. Sarva Mangal Mangalya Shive Sarvadi Sadike Sarane Trambaki Devi Gauri Narayani Namostute. And here's the talk. The Harappan culture of Indus Valley dating back some 10,000 BCE bore witness to the worship of an earth mother deity. Paleolithic figurines depict nature as mother in a fertility mode. And, you can see that in the first slide. The incoming Aryans with the ritual culture and unicornic polygods gave recognition to the female meter that was at once evocative of the feminine undercurrent of existence. The meter was called Gayatri, and eventually an iconic image was choreographed in mantra form, with which the goddess form is identified. So that's the image on the left there, and used widely in meditation, contemplation, and devotion. And then there was Saraswati. Gradually, the later Brahminic tradition and more popular Puranic extensions embraced and expanded feminine deities as significant counterparts to the plethora of masculine gendered devas, or gods, as we now call them after the Greeks, particularly the triune supremos, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh.
Dr. Bilmoria, we are not seeing your slides. You have to do screen share.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm so sorry about that. Yes, of course.
It is all right.
All right. So I now, oh dear. Okay, so screen share.
It should be under your video.
Yeah, right. No, I should have done that. So, okay, so let me begin. So not begin, but just show the slides that I would have been showing here. So here's the first slide of the fertility mother deity that goes back to the Harappan civilization some 10,000 years back, or at least 10,000 BC. And here's Gayatri, the goddess formed after the mantra or meter, which is in meter form. And then there is Saraswati, the goddess who is really a river, flies down from the skies to water the earth, basically, and add fertility to the land. And then you have the triune deities of Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, and you may see that in the left one there is the Brahma on the lotus, Vishnu lying on the serpent, and Shiva on the very left. So these were the male gods, but very soon there was the expansion of the feminine deities as significant counterparts to the plethora of these gods. And so eventually the goddess came into her own and stood transcendentally as the pristine creative force named as, named as Prakriti, Shakti, Bhu, and Devi. And so here we have the Prakriti. The word means it basically exalted, superior, excellent one, and the one who denotes creation, principle of conception and emanation. So the Prakriti is of the nature of Brahma, the god of creation, but in times supplants and subverts this god of creation. And the polarity of gender or sexuality becomes ambiguous, making possible androgynous manifestations of the supremely divine. So as you can see here in an iconic form, but also in statue, in carved forms that are carved. In the Himalayan and Tibetan Tantra, we also have a very similar deities, Yubyam, the Bhairavas, white Tara is specifically feminine, but certainly the one on the left is Jewel. This highest Prakriti is recognized as fivefold. When she is engaged in the work of creation, she appears as Durga. So the next slide, she appears as Durga, but as goddess of prosperity, she appears as Lakshmi. As goddess of learning, she appears as Saraswati. This great Devi, Saraswati, is the intelligence. Between the two of them, they represent intelligence, sleep, hunger, thirst, shadow, drowsiness, fatigue, kindness, memory, forbearance, empathy, peace, beauty, and consciousness, as well as contentment, nourishment, prosperity, and fortitude. She is sung in the Vedas and in the other scriptures as the Mahamaya of the nature of the universe. In reality, she is all Shakti of the universe. Shakti is the power of the feminine. It's a early 20th century painting by an artist called Ravi Verma. She holds balance in union in vocal and instrumental music. She is the goddess of speech. She's presiding deity in the knowledge of various subjects, in argumentations and disputations as well, which is why she's holding a book. In fact, all the beings earn their livelihood by taking recourse to her. She's peaceful and holds in her hand the veena or lute and books, as I mentioned. But she could also adorn a wrathful form. So the goddess is not just of the benign form, she could be also the wrathful form, fierce and vehement, tearing apart her own creation. And here she's stepping on Shiva, supposed to be the great male god. And Durga on the left. We just concluded the 9 days of worship of the goddess, where the 10th day is called Dasara, is the day of the victory of Durga over the great demon, which is the evil in ourselves, of course. She could also, in the twinkle of an eye, bring about destruction of the entire universe, which is called Pralaya. During this entropy, the Devi Vasundhara, earth, disappears. The whole world is deluged with water. And all this appearance of 5 elements called Prapancha vanish in the body of Prakriti. And she herself might cut her own head as a form of self-sacrifice. Her appearance, and also to disappear. Her appearance and disappearance occur in this period of Pralaya. It is the will indeed of the goddess, as described in this little verse. You are the victory in battle. May you, a boon giver, now grant me victory, Vijaya, in battle. O Kali, O great Kali, fond of liquor, flesh, and beast. And you see that in the Tibetan form as well. Thus, the goddess in one form or another is afforded elaborate worship in dedicated temples, roadside shrines, and multi-deity halls across the global Hindu diaspora. By 20th century, the goddess claimed 1/2 share of the 333,000 and a quarter Hindu deities all told, including, by the way, Our Lady of Velankani, plus other versions of Virgin Mother Mary in Christian chapels and altars across South India, across southern India.
It's 12 o'clock.
Right up to Karachi and Kathmandu. The third largest temple in India, the Meenakshi temple in Madurai in Tamil Nadu, is actually, an entire temple is dedicated to Meenakshi, the goddess of Hinduism. So unlike in the West, she's never lost in India. In fact, Tantra and regional cultures keep her going. Even the more right-wing evangelical, patriarchal, and monotheistic Hindutva rife in the Indian political space is not able to unseat the goddess in a myriad forms from the imaginary of the vast Hindu heterogeneity. And the Shakti theology holds ramifications for women's dis- and re-empowerment on the ground. So the last few slides. As I said, we just concluded the 9-day celebrations, and this is how one of the shrines at a home would look like. And now we're heading to Diwali, the Festival of Lights. The last 2 full moons, by the way, were dedicated to the goddess as well. Okay, so yes, and the image on the right is right here in San Francisco at a home basement shrine. So right across the Pacific coast, there are Hindu temples as well as Hindu shrines dedicated to the goddess. So I argue that the goddess as a symbol, or rather I argue goddess is a symbol in the work of Carol P. Christ, is too late for India because it already has so many goddesses, and there is scant room for new concepts of theology from the West, such as Gaia. Vandana Shiva is said to have said, no, thank you, we have our own from 2 millennia back. We could lend you some. And the corollary, it might be too early for the West since the exclusive and exclusionary patriarchal God of Abrahamic religions and affiliated politics are hardly ready to accept goddess or the myriad of goddesses in the post-secular, post-divinism on her own terms, as we've been hearing. But I think what I'm taking from this conference are some theological articulations, some new theological articulations, which I think will be helpful for people working on Shakta theology on the Indian side. Not to say that there is any shortage of the kind of theologies they've had, but there's some new interesting ideas that are coming out, and I'm very grateful and thank you. Thank you all for being with me. Shoot.
Thank you so much. All right, we're back to regular. So I'm going to now open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question, put in the chat like me, and I'll know to call, and hopefully we can call on everyone. So if you have a question, just go to chat, type me, and I will call your name. You don't have to type your question. All right. Vajrama.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate having a male kin here with us in our goddess explorations. We need more men on board, that is for sure. My question is, let me say the name correctly, Dr. I've got to read it, Dr. Disablót. I have a question for you. Yes, you present the gods, if I understand you correctly, as preceding the goddesses. You said the goddess finally came into her own. I have studied in the tradition, the Indian tradition of the Divine Mother and Tibetan Tantric Buddhism extensively. And I've always understood the great goddess to be the mother of all the gods. So I'm wondering why you present her as a kind of a later iteration of the divine.
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. Well, it's just going by what's in the Vedic, in the Vedic text. You do have a plethora of, sort of kind of hard to identify some of the gender that comes up, but we're going by linguistic processes as well. So you have Indra, Varuna, Rudra, and so on and so forth, and they're all in masculine gender. And there were no iconic forms at that time, so we don't actually know if there are male in kind of human projected form, or they're masculine in gender in the linguistic sense, right? In the language sense, as we can now identify ourselves in linguistically as either. So it's and also remember that the people who came in. So the Indus Valley is prior to the Aryan based Vedic tradition, right? It's in the Indus Valley, the very first slide that you see, there is certainly a feminine deity, fertility representations, and so forth. And I think it was much more indigenous to India for sure. But the Aryans, when they brought in the Vedic tradition, they were already patriarchal. I mean, you look at the caste system that they brought in. There were nomads. There were warriors. They were playing very much a male game that Caucasians, people from the Caucasus in Central Asia, were playing, all along. And their deities, their main deities, were male, and that's how it transformed even into the Puranic times into the Shiva was a form of Rudra in the Vedas. So it is argued Vishnu is a form of Narayana. Brahma is the sort of Prajapati of creation. So Prajapati is another. The god of creation is actually masculine in all respects, yes, not just in gender. So that's why.
Dr. Bilamorty, I think you're making my point, because it was my understanding that the Vedas came in when it was already patriarchalization going on,
right.
Preceding the Vedas. That's not our main source. Our main source is what precedes the Vedas,
right.
Which is the great goddess Kali, Durga, Shakti, the life force of the universe. So
right.
You're making my argument.
Well, right. True, but you see, once the patriarchal monotheistic, not so much monotheistic at the time, but it was polytheistic, set in, then it had to be subverted, and that's why I use the word subvert. right, and then she comes on her own again. Maybe I should have just added rather than comes on her own the first time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right, Mystic Mother Tracy Elise.
Hello. So blessed to be here. The energy of this gathering is special to me. The women here, the few men, I just want to start by saying that. And my question, so I'm working with quantum physics and scientific approach, like almost electrical engineering, to prove that God is female too. And my work has been in the realm of sacred sexuality, holy anointing, some of the really ancient priestess traditions. And you said in your lecture, which was lovely, thank you, you said, hey, they're not ready to accept you on your own terms. And I feel like the place that's missing in our connection with the whole is that women must take charge of sexuality, like we must. And we must take charge of sexuality and childbirth. And so do you have any thoughts as a learned gentleman who cared enough to show up today? How would you invite our men to look at the concept of goddess could improve their life in a body? I don't know do you have any window of perception where we could, because that's my work is sacred sexuality. Can you share with me any window of opportunity or a way of saying it that might make patriarchy go, let's look at that again? Sexuality, the way they define sacred as just married procreative. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, not very much of an activist. I'm more a scholar. That's where I was coming from. Well, I don't know, you look at the cover of Sophia, there's this Sophia goddess in the 9 forms. So that's one of the ways in which, we're trying to send messages to theologians and philosophers of religion and so forth that, wisdom is actually more feminine associated with, so that's one. And also I think bringing in other cultures into dialogue, into discussions, I think sort of, the multiculturalism, diversification would be other processes. I take my students to Hindu temples and Jain temples and so on, so that they could see what's going on in these places. That's another way. But of course, if you can use quantum physics and so on, I'm not quite sure how much gender there is or anybody's committed to the energy, the basic energy, neutrons and bosons to have any kind of gender at all. Defies all laws of nature, of course.
Yeah, we took to describing it in temple, we started with the yin-yang concept, and then we ended up just describing it as outflow, inflow. Because as soon as you include the other genders, you can't be saying feminine and masculine.
That's
you
right.
You have to be more inclusive.
Yeah.
So you would say just be inclusive, be in the age of Aquarius, keep it broadly interfaith. Yeah, that is the approach.
And one more thing I might say, it is also to combat violence. The culture of violence. Violence comes with patriarchy, and with to some extent monotheistically abated as well. And we have to actually combat and bring about more non-violence in peaceful society. I mean, look at the way Jains have lived. It's just absolutely extraordinary. There was the patriarchy has been so low in that because they were committed to non-violence. So that'll be another. And I think we need to look at how treatment of animals.
Wow.
I've got time for one more question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That is a nugget.
To the different panelists, this is a question. The various traditions of unbroken female goddesses differ in many ways from the reclaimed. Would some of the panelists talk further about similarities and differences? So what's the differences between the unbroken female goddesses versus the reclaimed female goddesses?
For the other panelists.
Well, I would just like to say that that's a very good question, and that is very difficult to get at. What is reclaimed versus unbroken line? I think maybe that's at the crux of it. Certainly, as a lot of the original claims about a pre-patriarchal culture was making, finding those threads that were continuous, which we face actually also here in the United States with indigenous cultures that were suppressed and then only acknowledged if they could find that kind of line. So I know I'm speaking generally, and I'm just pointing out why it's such an important conversation to have instead of giving an answer. There's a lot of debate, as you can imagine, in academic religious studies. There's a lot of saying you can't make universal claims. But then if you compare literature, like in the Middle East, of these different, I'm more familiar with that there's a lot of, through literature analysis, a lot of similarities between stories, even into the Christian Mother Mary birth story. So I just offer that.
I could say one little bit too about goddesses within heathen tradition. There are these textual sources like the Eddas, the Icelandic texts, which tell us some about mythology, but they don't have a lot to say about the goddesses. But that doesn't mean we can't know them. It means that we have to create our own new stories about them. So this is what happens within heathen tradition, is that what we call unverified personal gnosis becomes shared gnosis in when we share our stories and talk about our experiences of these goddesses in practice.
Thank you for everyone. I'm sorry the breakout room is about to close, but thank you to our panelists, and we're now going to go back to the main room.